Okay, so today we're going to go over rendering settings. So I use this same file for showing materials and stuff, so we'll see how this ends up rendering. So down here at the bottom is the show rendering dialog. I have this whole scene set up. I have all my lights hidden, so I'm going to unhide those real quick. Okay, so I have a bunch of studio lights in here. I use these as fill lights. In terms of color and that sort of thing, I always come into these studio lights and pretty much any light that I throw in from Revit, and I like to change this initial color. Originally, most of them come in as like incandescent or something like that. Under incandescent, you can see this brings in this real orangey light. It ends up not looking that great, so I like to change it to this fluorescent daylight. It reads a little bit more like an LED kind of colored light. So I change that, and it renders 100 times nicer. So I would recommend doing that on all of your lighting before you hit render, whether they be can lights or these little fill studio lights. I do have some can lights in there. If I highlight, let's see if I can grab, there it is. So you can see all these little circles. You can't see them in the view because they're all hidden by the beams, but I do have some can lights in there. I originally had some cove lights in here. I had some strip lights that were illuminating the barrel ceiling, but I didn't like the way those were coming in. So I ended up doing that in post-production in kind of Photoshop. Then I've basically got a couple can lights in this little ceiling block that I put in here as my soffits. So, other than that, those are pretty much all of the lights that I have in this model. I don't really have any windows, so I don't have to worry about daylight. I'm just worried about artificial lighting. So, I'm going to come down here to this Show Rendering Dialog button, hit the little teapot, and it opens up this dialog window. Now, I have a certain setting here. I have screen or printer. We'll get into the quality settings here in a second. But screen and printer are my two kind of big options here. Screen is going to render, it's great for any sort of digital presentations or just trying to see what things are going to render like on by looking at it on your screen. But if you go to print out a screen rendering, it's probably not going to be a great quality. It's like you can see here, it's only 825 pixels wide, 656 pixels tall. So that's, I mean, you're not even 3 inches wide in terms of a 300 DPI image that a lot of people like to print out as like a photograph kind of thing. Whereas if I flip over to printer, I can set what DPI I want this image to render at, and then it also tells me, okay, I've got this at 11 inches wide, 8 3/4 tall. To set those dimensions, I can click the edge of my my image here, and then go to size crop. And if I lock the proportions, if I stay on field of view and I change this, it's just going to basically do the same thing as me grabbing one of these little handheld things here, these little orbs, and then dragging it out. It expands that field of view a lot more. But I've pretty much honed in on exactly how I want to frame this view out. So I'll hit scale, lock the proportions. Under width, I could change this to 24 inches. I could change my height. Maybe I want my height to be 18 inches. You can set the overall size of your image by doing that. And then when you hit printer and set the DPI, it'll render at that image. Now, as you change from 150 DPI to 300 DPI, that's going to double your render time, essentially. And these are going to take a lot longer than your screen renderings, just because there's a lot more pixels to render and that sort of thing. So I would use screen to set your file up and just do some test renderings and that sort of thing. Printer for your overall final rendering. Getting down here to lighting, so you've got a bunch of different options, like what are you rendering? Are you rendering something with sun and artificial? Are you rendering just an artificial exterior, interior, all that sort of, all the different options of exterior and interior, artificial or sun. I recommend not rendering both your sun and your artificial at the same time. It causes problems because the sun overpowers your artificial light, and then it looks like your artificial light is pretty much doing nothing until Revit pretty much they've figured out the bug that causes your artificial light to be pretty much non-existent. I would recommend sticking to rendering those two things separately. What I typically like to do, and it allows you a little bit more controls, so unless the bug that they fix ends up really, really nice, I'll probably continue to render my artificial and sun separately. Then I take those exact same images, only difference in lighting, into Photoshop, overlay them, set the top layer to lighten, and then I can control those two versions of light separately, and maybe I don't want near as much daylight. I can darken that image and allow the interior light to shine through a little bit more. So it just gives you a little bit more control. That's just the way I prefer to do it. Then since in this image I've got, it's an interior and I just have artificial light, I'm going to select the interior artificial only setting. And then if I click on artificial lights here, it shows me all of the lights that I have in my file. If I were to have a ton more lights, I would start grouping these together. So I could create groups and say, okay, these are my can lights. And I could turn just my can lights on and off. I could dim all of my can lights at once. So that can be kind of handy if you want to be able to control like individual groups of things that you want to look essentially the same. So I can come in here and maybe I have like maybe this studio light, you can see as I highlight it, it turns it blue. Maybe this studio light is causing some sort of issue or some sort of it's bright spot on the ceiling here. I can dim that down so it's not causing near as much of a bright spot. Instead of 1 being the highest, I can dim it down to say like 0.5. So I don't want that one to emit, I want this one to emit half the light that all the other ones are. So you can kind of come in and do some dimming and that sort of thing there. Background color, this is mostly for exteriors, but interiors that have windows and that sort of thing. If you want to apply an image, you can. So maybe you've got an image of the site or something like that. You could play with the image and make it so that your building kind of sets in there. I also prefer to render with a white background and then do that sort of stuff in Photoshop, just so I have a little bit more control and I can settle things in there exactly how I want. So I tend to stick with a white color background and then just come in and Photoshop the stuff over that. Adjust exposure we'll get into after I do kind of a quick rendering here. So quality. Now these draft, low, medium, high, and best are those are probably a little bit of misnomers, just from the standpoint of a low and a medium rendering. Basically all this is doing is taking all the rendering settings and jacking them up as you go down the list here. But a high rendering versus a best rendering, you're going to see some difference, but then there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff that is going to probably look the same between high and best. So your lighting might look a little bit better, your shadows might look the exact same. Just the difference between those two might not be an enormous difference, but you're just increasing your render time quite a bit because you're increasing a bunch of settings that don't need to be across the board. So I will use like draft, low, and medium occasionally just to kind of get a sense of what my image is going to look like. So let's say I'll throw this on draft and hit render. This will go real quick and give us just kind of a good idea of how our lighting is working. So do we have any real bright hot spots? Is there anything that we need to look at and be like, ooh, the color of that isn't quite great? So you can see, okay, so this is looking pretty good. I've got a nice kind of overall light to it. I'm getting some highlights over here where I get those can lights kind of illuminating the stone on the bottles, and then my picture frame over here that I'll Photoshop an image on, and then my TV over here. So I'm getting a pretty good overall light. I don't have any real dark spots where it's going to get real annoying, where maybe this is causing a real harsh shadow on the wall here. This one does have a little bit of one, but I'm not too concerned with that. That doesn't bother me a ton. So I do have a really dark face to this this pool table here. So maybe I'll end up throwing another studio light back over in this direction to kind of illuminate the face of this pool table a little bit more. That way there's not quite so harsh of a shadow around it. So little things like that, the draft setting is good for that, so that you can kind of get an overall sense of things without waiting forever for that rendering to compute. So I'll go back to show model. If I come in here and go down here to edit, so I'll hit edit, it opens up this render quality settings. I recommend always starting with medium. Medium is a decent rendering. It's not fantastic, but it has a lot of things. If you go below medium, a lot of the settings get below kind of a threshold of you definitely notice the difference in those things. So I'm going to take medium and I'm going to hit copy to custom. And as soon as I hit copy to custom, it's going to allow me to edit all of these different settings that are built in here. So we'll go through all of these settings and I'll tell you kind of what they do and then how it impacts your render times and that sort of thing. So image precision, this does, and they give you a couple images on either side to show you kind of the difference between going low and going high on these does. So image precision is basically how crisp is your image. So the further down you get, the more kind of pixelated the edges and that sort of thing are going to look. And then the more you crank this up, the smoother everything is going to end up. So the trick here is honing in on what looks good but doesn't go overboard, because this does increase your render time quite a bit. I would personally never go up beyond an 8. The difference in render time from an 8 to a 9 is substantially larger than a 7 to an 8. So as you crank up here, you're getting more and more render time. As soon as you jump to a 9, it goes through the roof. So at an 8, if all the other settings are the same, an 8, let's say it takes you 2 hours to render an 8, you jump to a 9, that's going to all of a sudden take like 4, maybe 5, something like that, and then a 10 is exponentially more. So just something to be aware of. I tend to render everything on an 8 and then adjust other settings accordingly, and I've never had too much of a problem with it. I also render on an 8 at 300 dpi. So you could render at like a 7 at 600 dpi, and you take up more time rendering because of that 300 to 600 dpi jump, but it might look okay as well because of your resolution that you've cranked up. Reflection and transparency options. The number of reflections, all of these don't tend to impact your render time all that much unless you're doing, say, like an exterior that has a ton of glass on it. So if you have a lot of glass in your rendering, this is going to impact your render time a lot, just because for every shiny reflective surface, it's computing all of these settings here. But for the most part, if I don't have a ton of glass that I'm really concerned about how the reflections are going to look, I'll keep these basically where they are, and it doesn't tend to look too terrible. Soft shadows, I always enable soft shadows just because it's a little bit more realistic that way. Soft shadows basically allows for the edges of all of these shadows to be feathered lightly, rather than a real harsh line shadow, which you don't tend to get a whole lot in real life. Even shadows that seem like they have a harsh edge, they still have kind of a fuzzy edge to them. The soft shadow precision slider, it basically looks at that soft edge and determines how smooth it is. So over here you can see how grainy the edge of that is, and then over here it's nice and smooth. The 5 is usually pretty good. Unless you are really noticing a lot of this, I probably wouldn't touch this. It does increase your render time by cranking this up, but not too terribly much. So if you need to bump it up 1 or 2, it's not a big deal. But for the most part, on medium setting, you don't notice this kind of stuff too much unless you're really getting in there and staring at it real close, which in my experience, most clients aren't getting into the nitpickiness of, ooh, your shadow lines are really kind of grainy. So I don't tend to touch that too much. I might bump it up 1 here and there just on a whim if I've got the time to render and that sort of thing. Now your indirect illumination options, these do impact your render time pretty substantially. This and your image precision are the 2 things that impact your render time the most. So this is basically how well does it compute your lighting. Precision, just how accurately does it, how long does it take it to determine, where shadows are, how the light bounces around, that sort of thing. How many times does it allow the light to bounce around before it just says, okay, that light's done, I'm not going to compute that anymore. So increasing your bounces definitely increases your render time. Precision increases your render time quite a bit. Smoothness definitely increases your render time pretty substantially. But smoothness is the one that will impact your image, the overall look of your image the most. So you might render and see little white flecks all over your image. That is a product of your indirect illumination smoothness or your image precision. So if you have a low image precision setting, you're going to end up with some little white pixels here and there. If you have a low indirect illumination smoothness, you'll get some little white flecks here and there. Just because, and you can kind of see in their example here, it's kind of a splotchiness to that light. That's a product of your illumination smoothness. Daylight portals, they can make the difference in sunlit interiors a lot, but they also really impact your render time. So you could easily double a render time by turning daylight portal options on. I tend to stay away from it just because the increase in render time to me isn't worth it. If you want to play with it and see whether you think it's worth it, go for it. But I've never found it to be worth it to turn these on and then have my render take 2-3 times longer because of it. So that is basically your render settings. So my default settings are usually image precision 8. I might bump this up 1. Smoothness I'll bump up to 6. Precision 4, and bounces 3. Like, that's pretty much my standard. If I rendered this on medium and I was getting a lot of the little white flecks that I was talking about, I might bump this up to 7 just to make sure I don't render the whole thing and then still end up with a bunch of little white flecks on it. So those are kind of my standards that I like to run with on most of my images. And then I can set my render settings to custom here. And then I'll go to printer, say 300 DPI, and render this whole thing at 11 inches wide, 8 3/4 tall, so that I end up with the image that I want, and then I can export it and then take it into Photoshop and do whatever I want in it. Now, when you have a rendering that's completed, and this is showing the rendering that I rendered with the draft, you can, once the rendering is done, if it's really dark or really bright, you can adjust the exposure after the fact. So I can bring this down, hit apply, and change kind of how this is looking afterwards with these settings. So you can't change your render settings up here, but you can change your exposure control afterwards. So that's something to just be aware of. You don't need to sit here and let it render all over again, just because it came out really light or really dark. One other thing to note here, and I'll render this on medium here so that we can see a little bit of difference. When you hit render, the first half of the render process is your lighting. So if the first half takes an hour and a half to render, that doesn't mean the second half is going to take an hour and a half to render. The second half would be your image kind of settings, so your image precision and all of that sort of stuff, whereas the first half is your indirect illumination smoothness, bounces, precision, that sort of stuff. So as this goes through, and you'll also notice that we're at 16% here, and a lot of the image is already computed. It does not take into account that these blocks are bigger than the little spaces that it has in between. So you'll notice as soon as we get these big blocks kind of out of the way, this starts going up quite a bit faster because it's not computing the whole block, it's computing these smaller ones. So now here it goes quite a bit quicker because it doesn't distinguish between that was a lot more than 20% that we calculated using the big blocks. So the first half is your lighting. So if you come back to a rendering and it's taken a lot longer, but you're at 49%, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got twice as long as you've waited to wait on that to be done. So let's see, this is almost at 50%. That took a minute and a half, and then it's going to do the actual image second. So this is dependent on our image precision settings, and it's looking like this is going to be done quite a bit. So the first half took a minute and a half. If the second half was going to take the exact same amount of time, we'd end up at 3 minutes. It's looking like we're probably going to be done by like 2 minutes, 20 seconds, something like that. So it's quite a bit faster on the second end just because our image precision stuff took far less time. And the first half of your image will take a lot longer to render the more lights you have. So the more artificial lights you put in there, the longer that's going to take. So now looking at this, you can see these little white flecks that we're getting here and here. That's an product of the image or the illumination, indirect illumination smoothness. So when I went into my custom settings, I bumped that up a few just so that we can eliminate those. Those will also get taken care of a little bit with my image precision. So overall, not a terrible image. I usually take this into Photoshop and crank up the contrast a little bit, makes it pop a little bit more. I also really like to kind of emphasize the edges of stuff just a touch, very, very little. So I will actually come in and export the hidden line view. I'll hide all of my lights there, and then I'll export this at the exact same size as my rendering, and then bring it into Photoshop, overlay it, throw it on multiply, and then take the opacity down to like a 12 or 13%, and it takes the line work and just adds just a touch of emphasis on the edges, which makes it pop just a little bit more. Also makes it really handy to have your line work in Photoshop, because if I want to select this wall, I can just magic wand on the hidden line view and click it, and it'll automatically select that little area, since it's just going to go to the boundary of the white and the black lines. So this view can be really helpful in your post-processing, just being able to select surfaces and that sort of thing. So just something to keep in mind and use to speed up your process a little bit. So that is pretty much rendering.